Corporate headlines concerning the governance of Chesapeake Energy, the Susan B. Komen Foundation, Parkland Hospital, and HP concern many of us who work for good corporate governance practices. The Wall Street firms that broke the financial system all experienced poor oversight at the board level, among other things. On this program, we're going to hear how good board members help their organization succeed and perhaps a story or two of bad behavior. Let's meet the experts. First, from New York City, Bob Kippers is the managing partner of Deloitte's Corporate Governance Center, was recognized by Directorship Magazine as one of the top 100 influential professionals in corporate governance. Bob, welcome to Texas.
Thank you, Dennis.
And sitting next to you is someone who doesn't even live in this country. He's from Toronto, Canada, Richard LeBlanc. He's an award-winning teacher, researcher, consultant, lawyer, and specialist on boards of directors. He's also an associate professor at York University in Toronto, and he's the author of this book, Inside the Boardroom, How Boards Really Work and the Coming Revolution in Corporate Governance. Richard, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Dennis. Good to be here.
So let's just start with this. What do good board members do?
Board members oversee management in the interests of shareholders. There are tens of thousands of boards of organizations of various shapes and sizes, but at the end of the day, boards oversee the financial statements. They make sure compensation is appropriate. They set the strategy for the organization. They oversee the risks of the organization, and they communicate and are accountable to shareholders.
Well, now, every board member is supposed to do that.
Correct.
And the good ones do it well.
Correct.
Right. Okay. Bob, what do good board members do from your perspective?
I'm largely in agreement with Richard, but the way I think about it is, what are the top 3 activities that take up the board's time, energy, and talent? And you touched on it, Richard. Strategy, the strategy of the organization, where's it headed? Do we have the right person in charge running the organization as management? That would be the CEO in almost all cases. And then how does risk relate to the strategy, and how can we see things that are coming before they arrive on our doorstep? What process is in place? What's really important is oversight is different than managing the business. Boards that get in trouble either disconnect or try to manage the company when they should be watching over it.
Well, exactly. And your Corporate Governance Center, Deloitte, and the National Association of Corporate Directors, I'm on the national faculty for, the Institute for Excellence in Corporate Governance at UTD. A lot of places we're focused on these issues. But the focus on strategy and the risk involved in that strategy has really come to light, Bob, in the last few years. For what reason, do you think?
As I talk to clients, the top issue, when I say, I'll come and talk to you about anything you want in governance, what would you like to talk about? There's 2 answers I get: regulatory or risk. In other words, what's changing in Washington and what are the risks? I say, well, the regulatory is just another kind of risk. What you really want to talk about is risk. And the difficulty is, too few organizations have what I'll call a highly effective and understood way to manage the risk and to have that dialogue that's so necessary for a board to have the back and forth. Everyone's looking for a method, a way, a quick, quick answer, and it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, there's not a quick answer. We can talk about something that viewer probably doesn't care about, enterprise risk management, as ERM as we call it, until the cows come home, but they won't get it. There's no magic bullet, I guess. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly right. And a lot of times they'll say, I know, we need a chief risk officer. And when you do that, that might work. It's big in financial services. Well, then that's the guy who's got to worry about it. Everybody else doesn't have to pay attention. That's the difficulty with whichever way you go.
Right. But the board, Richard, can't give up this overall responsibility for risk. Is that a fair statement?
Right, and it's overseeing all risks now, not just financial risks, but food safety risk, depending on the business you're in, compliance risk. But what I'm hearing from investors and from boards is that there's too much of an emphasis on risk and compliance since Sarbanes-Oxley and since Dodd-Frank. And what is being underemphasized right now is strategy. And that's in part fault to the regulations because they want independent directors. So what ends up happening is that you bring on directors that are independent of the company. They don't know about the business. They don't know about the industry. And they're now charged with adding value for shareholders and overseeing management that has worked in the industry for 30 or 40 years. So the challenge now for corporate boards is to move away from a compliance mentality, and shareholders are insisting of growth and innovation and competitiveness for the U.S. economy and other economies, and we have uncertainty now with Europe, China, etc. So shareholders want more of their boards and are more demanding of their boards in terms of growth and creation of shareholder value. We had a case in Canada, for example, where CP, a hedge fund in New York, came up to CP. We didn't have one person on the CP board that
CP stands for
Canadian Pacific Rail.
Thank you.
That had rail experience. So there's a tendency to go for the independent directors because that's what the regulators want. And we have accountants, we have lawyers now that are advising on compliance and are advising on risk. And what I'm hearing from boards is that our number one challenge is to add value to management. It's strategy and succession planning.
Okay, good. Now, he talked about the word independent several times. Bob, tell us and tell that viewer what independent means in this forum that we're talking about here.
Most boards are comprised mostly of independent directors, meaning they're not people that work for the company. They're not people that are employees or executives. There may be retired folks, retired CEOs, they may be active CEOs, but they're from other companies. Some companies will have one or two people who are actually in the employ of the organization. Typically the CEO might also be the chairman. Obviously he's an employee, but he's also leading the business. The idea is that independent point of view, it's a part-time job. You know, people spend 200, 300, 400 hours a year. They don't get up every day and come to the company. So they come in and out. You know, they have a different perspective. And while I agree with Richard to some degree, the best boards, in my view, have some industry expertise represented. But the best questions often come from the directors that know nothing about the business. You know, a retailer, big client of ours, they got a manufacturing guy from Europe. And this is a U.S. retailer. He asks the greatest questions because he hasn't drunk the Kool-Aid. He's just trying to figure out, does it make any sense?
Yeah, and Richard, that's a tough balance to put in there, isn't it? How do you? I mean, you've interviewed hundreds of board members for the book you wrote and the books you're working on. Right. And you have listened to what they've said. You've watched the boards actually meet. Give us some idea about what he said there in this regard.
Well, what Bob and I think are saying, and what directors I've interviewed have said, is that we are moving towards a competency matrix. We're looking at what do we need, what are the skill sets we need on the board, industry experience, compensation, risk, and boards now are they're just beginning in the U.S. to ask themselves what skills do we need and what behaviors do we need. Communication, leadership, integrity. You know, these softer skills are vitally important in a boardroom because you've got, 8, 9, 10 people, 11 people with, large egos. They need to be all work as a team. They need to be well led by an independent chair or an independent lead director. So the softer skills are really important. You can be formally independent. You can have the competencies, but if you don't behave in a certain way and add value and have polished skills, you can take one or two people can take a board off track. It doesn't take much. So now search firms and nominating committees are looking at the softer skills of directors and the hard skills to bring on the best directors.
Now, I'm going to tell the story about how you and I met in a minute about these soft skills, but first, Bob, you mentioned something about, or maybe it was Richard mentioned something about a matrix. And so if we look at what skills we want on that board, obviously a lot of that is driven by the strategy that's going to be there in the future. Talk to us about how companies are using a matrix to figure out what we have on the board and what we need on the board, and then how we go find it.
So basically, it's fairly simple, and it's sort of brilliant because, let's say you're a consumer products company, and you've got nobody with a marketing background. You have no consumer experience on that board. You're going to have a heck of a time getting effective oversight of the strategy and the execution. So what you do is you put the things you're looking for down one column, and you go across the top, and you figure out where you've got gaps. We really need somebody who's got a certain kind of experience. And by the way, we've never had it on this board. I don't know why, but now that we write it down, we lay it out like that, it's obvious. We got to get a recruiting firm in here to go find us a board member. We need one of those. And it's the conversation that never's had. Yeah. And now people are doing it.
Yeah, it wasn't had before because all the board members were found by
who you know.
Yeah. Who you know,
That's right.
The good old boy system,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Right.
yeah, and that's happening a little less now, but it's still happening. But Bob is right; it's very hard to put pen to paper, and because you're not good at everything, and you want to say who you know, the rub comes in is not only the skills, but who's good at what, and then who might not have the skill set that is needed for the next 2, 3, 5 years. We also have a movement now to bring on women and bring on visible minorities and because the academics have found that they ask the fresh questions and you don't have groupthink. So you have a turnover of boards right now where they're just beginning to look at, you know, who do we have and what do we need, not who do you know. So that's really important, and it's tough to look inward like that and to self-assess yourself because you're a group of a very small group of people.
Yeah, because the problem is, Bob, and correct me if I'm wrong, the problem is the board has to find people to refresh itself, as we say in the National Association of Corporate Directors, refresh itself, unless the shareholders decide to do it for us.
Which has changed a lot because now we're talking about no staggered boards. We're talking about annual election of directors, meaning at any one year you could be out. We're also taking a really hard look. This diversity point, I must tell you, is huge. 16% of the Fortune 500 directors are women, just to do a gender diversity cut. You know, if you do racial diversity and other measures, it's even less. And yet, 85% of the women in this country are involved with financial spending decisions.
Purchase decisions, absolutely.
And you know, 16, 85, maybe we're a little underrepresented. And by the way, those companies that have 30% or more outperform the other companies in terms of actual financial results.
Okay, so and that's where the rubber meets the road in research, isn't it? And whether you're doing that at York University or whether you're doing it at NYU, we're going to have a guy on a program one of these days named Baruch Lev at NYU. We've got a guy at UT Dallas, Suresh Radhakrishnan, and others, doing great research on what actually works, Richard, so what actually is working in diversity.
Well, the assumption is that CEOs make the best directors, and the research coming out of Stanford University is that, in fact, they don't. They are often stretched and they're dominant in terms of their personality type. So we're looking at mixing it up, of renewal, of asking questions, of not being from the sector. Companies are approaching this. Countries are approaching this in different ways. Some countries, there's a 40% quota that could happen in Europe. For women. In Quebec, we had a law 3 years ago that 50% of all boards have to be women, and they have to match the cultural diversity of the community. So it is the #1 issue in corporate governance. The other issue is shareholders want to have a say on who gets on boards. I teach my students that shareholders elect directors. They really don't. Directors self-select themselves. So what's happening now is we have the diversification, a focus on renewal, a focus on skill sets, a focus on shareholder input. Because regulators don't want to have another financial crisis, so they want to ensure that the best people, the best talented people are inside the boardroom in helping management. So we're seeing an uptick now of what should have happened 10 or 20 years ago, but it's just starting now.
And a lot of people would say, and I'm going to come back to how Richard and I met in a minute, but I'm going to focus on, go back to Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank for a minute. There is this idea of all the compliance we've had to deal with because of these laws. These laws came along, Bob, because there were some bad things happening. Take us back to, let's say, just prior to Enron. Give us a couple of examples of the things that were happening and why we ended up with Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank.
Well, the world has changed absolutely since the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley, but in the scandals leading up to that, and I actually had some experience with some of these companies. They weren't clients at the time, but when they got in trouble, I went and spent some time. I was shocked and appalled at how these boards actually operated. They would call a board meeting on a minute's notice without any information, any advanced materials, take decisions on a telephone call, you know, on a 20-minute board meeting, something that would be massively important to shareholders. And if anybody was inside looking at that, you know, it would take you a nanosecond to realize if this is the way things work, I'm surprised anything works at all. And you know, we all saw the results, and we're all paying the price for that. But I will tell you, and I disagree with Richard a little bit, the years following those laws, the passage, it was compliance almost 120%. But finally, it's down to less than 50. You know, it's shrinking on the agenda while some of these other issues we're rebalancing the agenda. Because what happens is, it's not just the full board. A lot of the work gets done in committees. the audit committee, the finance committee, the nominating and governance committee. That's where a lot of the decisions actually get made. And I'm seeing progress in people opening the aperture.
There's been a sea change in corporate governance. 10 years ago, would go to meetings and you'd see the book crack. You'd have directors falling asleep at meetings. The average directorship now is 300 hours a year. No good director can sit on more than 2 or 3 boards. It's just the responsibilities are so great, and anything can go wrong in the company. So you absolutely have to be at the top of your game to serve on public and not-for-profit boards, by the way.
Exactly. We'll talk about not-for-profits too. So I'm going to lead into this. One of the things that we focus on in the corporate governance area is having the right people on the board. And that matrix that you were talking about, whether there's industry experience there, but yet not so much of it that we all don't have groupthink, all those things are important. And I was sitting in Washington, D.C. at the NACD meeting about 2 or 3 years ago, and a lady that you know, Michelle Hooper, was making a good presentation there on having the right people through the Nominating and Governance Committee. But we took a break, and there was a lady still sitting at the table I was sitting at, and I said to her, her name was Liz, you'll know what her last name is, I don't, Richard. And I said, you know, having the right people on the board in terms of their skill sets is great. But my experience in boardrooms is this, and that is, it's what actually happens in the boardroom. It's the behaviors in the boardroom. And I said to Liz, I said, who's doing some research on this? She said, I got just the guy for you. And she gave me Richard's name, okay?
Good.
So Richard, talk to us about, you said earlier about these soft skills, but talk to us about the behaviors, because if you can have the greatest people, men, women, everything you can, but if the dynamics don't work, it doesn't work either. What makes it work and what keeps it from working inside the room?
Well, what makes it work is attention to communication, listening, persuasiveness, integrity, how you relate to your colleagues, your tone that you use, the words that you use. These things are underemphasized at the cradle grave and also in terms of the assessment. So I had said to our Securities Commission in Canada, you need to have all your boards across Canada assess peer assessment, individual director, self and peer assessment, and all the boards in Canada now do that. The United States is just they actually cited my book, the Securities and Exchange Commission. They're just starting to do this now, where they're saying that boards have to have a self and a peer assessment. Interestingly enough, you don't have a regulatory requirement. Your requirement is to assess committees and boards, but not individual directors. So now you need to look at the skills and qualities of the individual in order to have a collective good dynamic. And if someone, for example, is too controlling or too critical or doesn't prepare for meetings, isn't committed, doesn't have integrity, doesn't match what they say and do, doesn't support board decisions, undermines management, the tone is not there, that defect should be detected and should be either coached or developed or mentored or counseled that person off the board. That is what great boards do. They from time to time, they look at the individual director skill sets and they try to tinker with it. And some people can't change, and some people can't change, and then therefore, or they don't want to change, and therefore they shouldn't be on the board.
Now, Bob, at the center, at Deloitte Center,
Right.
I read the stuff you guys put out. You guys are starting to write about this stuff too. Do you find that that's important as well?
Well, I think the peer-to-peer is painful because it causes directors to actually call out fellow directors. And the people that really hate this more than anything, this is a U.S. deal, are the general counsels. Do they really want a record saying that 3 of our directors aren't up to snuff? And of course, it frightens the lawyers to think about litigation. But here's the deal. I think the qualifications and activities, all that's fine. But the behavior is what really can change the effectiveness of the board. So you've got people like the nitpicker, the timekeeper, you know, and the people that start every presentation, this is always a trouble signal, I'll be brief. In other words, those 3 words scare the heck out of me because you've got 27 minutes on the agenda. Are you trying to make up time, or people checking their watch every? I mean, there are some people on boards that their role, they've self-anointed, is that we're running behind. You know, I have a flight. You know, that's exactly what happens to cause boards to miss something. And then you've got those directors, I mean, I call these effectiveness blockers. They assume that if everybody else in the room seems to be nodding and happy, it must be okay failing to take their personal responsibility, and they may be the only one with the good question, but they kind of look at the group and say, well, I guess
that's
okay.
groupthink. That happens.
Very frightening.
That's the group think. Now, you guys correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I've said this to a lot of boards in my life. It is often the case that it is that person, that man or woman, sitting there, not saying a whole lot, not being out front on every issue, who comes sometimes is the best thinker if you can just have someone at the chairman level, as an example, or lead director level, who can draw them out. Yes or no?
That's right.
Richard?
You go around the room for the key decisions. You know you're a conductor. You know who, just by reading the body language, by who wants. What you don't want is artificial agreement, and that's where decision failure can happen. So Bob's exactly right. You want to be able to. It's an art. It really is. Chairing a good board is an art, and the most important decision a board makes is not only who's the CEO but also who's the chair. So behavior absolutely matters.
All right. Let me talk about two things. We only have about 5 or 6 minutes left. I really hate that, but Bob, one of the things you said earlier is that a board chooses the CEO. Maybe the most important decision they make. Years ago, an economist who has since died said to me, he said, the first item on the agenda of every board meeting should be this: should we fire the CEO? Now, it's not on there in writing, but do effective boards have that? I mean, I'm not talking about meeting after meeting, but I mean, is that always in their mind? Should it be in their mind? Do we have the right person running this organization?
Well, the only way to have a good conversation around that very important topic is if the chairman and CEO, if the chairman is the CEO, then you've got to have your executive session run by the lead director. I think it is on the minds, as the CEO is presenting about what's happening in the business, and he brings members of his team in, and that board is watching and getting a feel for what's going on through their questions. I think that is an omnipresent question. Are we on the right track? And if we're not, how come the CEO didn't keep us?
Just briefly, CEO succession planning is poorly done by many boards. The average board spends 2 hours a year. It's the most important decision the board makes, and they spend 2 hours a year.
Wow.
39% of boards don't have an immediate successor for the CEO. So I agree with Bob, but it's poorly done oftentimes.
Exactly. So if that's the case, one of the big decisions and one of the big headlines in the last few years has been compensation, and deciding how much that CEO makes, doesn't make. How difficult is that, Bob?
It's the number one issue to many. It's the issue that will not go away, and we now have say on pay, and 89 or 90% of pay packages are approved. Some are not, but it's the minority. But we have evolved to a place where CEO pay, and I'll pick on the CEO, is so outsized compared to any value or anybody else working in that organization that I don't know how to recalibrate it.
The University of Delaware just came out with a study last week that 17% of structural increases are due to peer groups and paying the CEO at 50, 75, or 9. And what's happened is CEO pay to the average worker has gotten so out of whack in the last 10, 15, 20 years. It's 400, 500, 600 times. And there's examples of that where you don't have the performance. So Bob's right. It's the number one issue. It's not going away, and there's more regulations to come because regulators want to ensure that you have pay for performance, and you don't have the incredible wealth disparities that we're having lately.
Just a footnote. So the short straw used to be the audit committee.
It's
now
the
it's hard,
compensation
it's
committee.
gritty, and it's now the compensation committee.
Yeah, at least we got off the audit committee, which is good. I just have a couple of minutes left. I want to talk about not-for-profits, because that person watching may be on a not-for-profit board. Chances are they are, maybe one or two. Is there any difference in these two, or are not-for-profit boards just as important that they perform? They're
absolutely just as important because they're often the starting ground for directorships. They deal with children, they deal with students, they deal with beneficiaries. Just because you volunteer doesn't mean they're not important or you don't have risks. So it's a sector that is just crucial, and we may be doing work together, Dennis, on offering a program at your Institute for Not-for-Profit Directors, as I mentioned to Bob earlier. It's a vital sector. It's often the training ground, and they make decisions that affect vulnerable people. One of the things that you get to do, Bob, you probably don't serve on a lot of for-profit boards because of your job,
right.
But I know that you serve on
not-for-profit boards.
I do.
How important are they in your estimation? What does it take to make them effective?
Well, it's interesting. We tracked for both for-profit and then, NFP or not-for-profit, what are the top 10 issues? And it's everything from the CEO and his compensation, but it's strategy, all those same things. I think it was 8 or 9 out of 10 were identical. They may have been 1 or 2 up or down, but they were the same issues. And board dynamics, same point. Even though you're not paid, if you're going to sign on to be on a board for not-for-profit, you're expected to act in a fiduciary capacity just like if you were at a big corporate board.
Mm-hmm.
We have 45 seconds left. You have 20 seconds of that, Richard. Go for it.
Is there anything I haven't said that I wanted to say? I guess the number one issues right now are compensation, diversity of boards, separation of chair and CEO in the U.S. is a big issue. This is not going away. This is another 5 or 10 years. We're not where we need to be, but we're making steady progress.
Thanks to you. And Bob, you have the last words.
Just a point that I think is an emerging area, and that is getting the diversity equation right on boards could actually make them more effective. It's a #1 priority. I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and I think we should all do the same.
Well, I appreciate the two of you being here. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your watching because, perhaps you do serve on a nonprofit board or one that's for profit. If so, we believe you have a tremendous responsibility for good service.